During the emperor's stay at Ebersdorf, he went every day at noon to visit Marshall Lannes, who could not be removed to a distance greater than one of the houses of the village. Having received one day a message that the marshal was desirous to see him, he hastened to the spot. A delirious fever had come upon that unfortunate general, whose spirits, however, revived. When he beheld the emperor, he had dreamed that an attempt was made upon his life, and said to him that, being unable to walk, he had sent to request he would come to defend him. The emperor was deeply afflicted at seeing the marshal in this state. The medical men requested him to withdraw because the patient's case was desperate, and he returned home in a great distress of mind. 2 hours afterwards, he was again told that Marshall Lannes wished to bid him farewell. He immediately went to see him, but on his arrival, Monsieur Ivan, the doctor and attendants, came up to inform him that the patient had expired a few minutes before. In Marshall Lannes, we lost one of the most gallant men our armies could any time boast of. His life was too short for his friends, but his career of honor and glory was without a parallel. The emperor was in every respect deeply penetrated at this loss. He left Ebersdorf the same night. We were at the commencement of June, and the heat was excessive. In order to avoid the dust, he directed his suite, consisting of nearly 50 individuals of all ranks, to remain behind, and kept me only with him. I had no doubt he wished to speak to me about Russia. And this was, in fact, the subject that occupied his mind. He asked me what I thought of the manner in which that country had treated him, prefacing the question by the following observations. It was fortunate for me that I placed no dependence upon such allies. Could worse have happened to me had I not made peace with Russians? What advantage do I derive from their alliance if they are not in a condition to guarantee me the permanence of peace in Germany? It is much more likely that they would have turned against me had not some regard for character restrained them from so soon breaking their plighted faith. I must not give way to vain illusion. They have all sworn my ruin, but have not the courage to compass it. I can understand that the Emperor Alexander should not come to my assistance, but whatever reasons may be urged for his permitting Warsaw to be invaded in the very teeth of his army, I must infer from this conduct that our treaty of alliance is a mere dead letter, and that he is duping me. He perhaps imagines that he confers favor enough by not declaring war against me. Had I, however, suspected this previously to embarking in the enterprise upon Spain, I should now feel little uneasiness at any determination he might come to. Will it again be said now that I fail in my engagements and cannot remain at peace? He then asked me what I thought of St. Petersburg. I replied in the following words. I am, sire, of opinion that, laying aside the Emperor of Russia's personal sentiments of regard for your majesty, that monarch is not sorry to see you so much engaged, and that the Austrians would never have begun the war into which they have so unjustly forced us had they not been assured of the state of inaction, at least, of the Russians. I am also persuaded, however, that the Emperor is the only man in Russia who desires to adhere to the alliance with your majesty, that he is urged on all sides to declare himself, and if we were to afford him the pretext for doing so, we should thereby divest him of what little moral power he still opposes to the wishes of those by whom he's surrounded, and thus leave the course open to him. It is also very true that we derive no advantage from that alliance, except Russia's abstaining from declaring wars against us, but she will not prevent our being attacked, and it will probably be our best plan not to rely upon her effectual assistance, though on no other occasion could we stand more in need of it. The Emperor listened attentively to me, but did not utter a single word in reply. He continued riding at a slow pace until he reached the gate of the suburbs of Vienna, when he proceeded at a gallop to the palace of Schönbrunn. His headquarters remained there until the reopening of the campaign, but he went every day to visit the island of Lobau and the works of the Great Bridge. The lapse of each week in this state of quiet was of important advantage to him. The regiments were recruiting their strength, and the artillery was reorganizing itself. The Austrian military stores were of great assistance to us on this occasion. The emperor was indefatigably active, and everyone else followed his example. The most gigantic works ever undertaken in any campaign were those which the engineer department executed on the Danube in the present year. No parallel to them can be found even in the immortal works of the Roman armies. We only waited their full completion to commence those operations which were to decide the fate of the campaign. The Austrian armies, on the other hand, were not inactive, though through their exertions fell far short of ours. The principal army, under the orders of the Archduke Charles, which had been joined by that of General Clenau, was encamped in a line almost perpendicular to the Danube, with its left at the village of Markgraf Neusiedl, its center at Wagram, and its right in the direction of Edersklav, the advance guard being stationed along the bank of the Danube, facing the island of Lobau. The army of the Duchy of Warsaw, although twice as numerous as the Polish army of Prince Poniatowski, could never obtain the advantage in any engagement with the latter, which covered itself with glory whenever it was compelled to fight a battle. Had it received the smallest assistance, it would have taken the offensive on a large scale and undoubtedly obtained successes worthy of its patriotism and of the courage so characteristic of the soldiers of that country. But the Russians never stirred, though always promising to advance. Those assurances of assistance were only calculated to compromise them with both parties. The Grand Austrian Army was giving some indications of the intention to effect a passage at Pressburg. They had a pontoon train at that place, and the Austrians had just taken possession of a small island facing the city, and very near the right bank, from which it was only separated by a very small arm of the Danube, so that they might have established here their grand bridge without encountering any difficulty. Had they succeeded in crossing over, the emperor would have been placed in a very critical position, because by that operation the junction of the Austrian armies would have been effected. And as the distance from Pressburg to Vienna is only 6 leagues, all our works at Ebersdorf must have been abandoned, however important we felt it to be to complete them. The emperor ordered Marshal Davout to force the enemy out of that island, an order which was immediately carried into execution. He also accompanied this attack with a discharge from about 100 howitzers, which he fired into Pressburg. These demonstrations answered the purpose. The Austrian staff was dissatisfied at seeing so large a city exposed to the ravages of fire, and requested it might be spared. Emperor consented to the request, and from that moment the project of a passage was abandoned. The Austrian army, which had just evacuated Italy, had reached the plateau in advance to the town of Rab, on the river of that name, at the same time that the army, under the orders of the Viceroy of Italy, had descended from the mountains that separate Germany from Italy. The Viceroy, having marched against the army which was in front of Rab, found some difficulty in maintaining his ground on the plateau, but by his personal firmness he led the troops onto the charge, and not only succeeded in keeping possession of it, but he also broke the Austrian army and compelled it to recross the Rab, after leaving a garrison in the town of the same name, which the Viceroy immediately blockaded. The emperor felt anxious to secure the possession of that place in order to deprive the enemy of all further means of crossing the river, and to make the Viceroy take a part in the important events of which he was laying the foundation and which were now at hand. The workmen were so much urged that in a few days it was found practicable to open a fire from the trench. The enemy no doubt felt a reluctance to sacrifice an important town to no purpose, since another direction was given to the army which they had in that quarter. They recalled it to the left bank of the Danube, and it came to take up a position at Pressburg, from whence it opened a communication with the Archduke Charles by means of the bridge established on the Marsh, a river which separates Hungary from Moravia. The Austrians were really at this time in a formidable attitude. They might even have recalled the corps stationed in Poland. Such a powerful mass as they now presented could have nothing to fear from the Poles. admitting even that the Russians had acted openly against them. They were so far removed from the scene of action that they never could have arrived until after the blow had been struck. The Austrians acted otherwise, however, and waited until the emperor was ready. So great was the terror of his name that their whole attention was bent upon watching what he should undertake, without considering that their commanding force might have enabled them to attempt. The emperor did not suffer a day to pass without reviewing some of his troops and examining in person whether the orders he had issued had been carried into execution. He went every afternoon to visit the works going forward in the island of Lobau, and he then examined how far his directions had been attended to. When surrounded on those occasions by artillery and engineer officers, it was almost impossible to get him away, and night had always set in when we returned to the palace of Schönbrunn. At last, the long-wished-for moment arrived. After 22 days of unparalleled labor, the engineer branch of the army, under the orders of General Bertrand, completed a bridge upon piles from one bank of the Danube to the other, being a length of 240 toises. This bridge served as a stockade to the bridge of boats below it. Above the bridge of piles there was another of the same kind, 8 or 10 feet wide, which served as a stockade to the large one, and was also used for those constant communications which might otherwise have interrupted the passage of the columns filing along the 2 large bridges. Independently of these, there were 3 large hanging bridges thrown over the 2 small arms which run through the island of Lobau. And lastly, in a kind of sewer communicating with the arm of the Danube, which separated us from the enemy, we had first the pontoon train used for the passage of the 20th of May, and 3 other trains which the emperor had ordered to be constructed in the island and on the side of the sewer. They were ranged in the following order. The 2 at the further extremity were formed of 2 boats furnished with all their rigging, and ready covered over with their small beams and broad planks, so that nothing more was necessary for constructing the bridge than to assemble 5 or 6 of the masts so arranged. The pontoon train at the mouth of the sewer was complete in every respect and covered over with planks, and was to be launched in one solid mass. Though its length was not less than 240 feet, it was the invention of a naval engineer officer who undertook to mount it. The work appeared so extraordinary that a model was taken from it by the artillery, and I have since seen that model at Paris, in the hall destined for the reception of all objects of art connected with that branch of the service. The bridge, which had been used for the first passage, was reloaded upon carts, and a bridge made of trading boats was laid along the Danube in that part where it was wholly unobstructed, so as to be brought, if necessary, to the entrance of the branch we had to cross over. The border of this latter branch of the river was lined in all its extent with a great number of Austrian field pieces, which were mounted upon new carriages made for the express purpose of the arsenal of Vienna. The greater part of those cannon were of a very large bore, and had formerly lain unmounted on the ramparts of Vienna or in the ditches adjoining them. Provisions had been collected at Ebersdorf for the immense army which was about to take up that position, and the hospital branch of the military administration had likewise been carefully attended to. The month of June had passed away without any explosion, either at a distance from us or in our immediate vicinity. The emperor dispatched to all the corps his orders for their forming a junction at Ebersdorf. They had been written and signed many days before, but had the exact date of their transmission affixed to them, as well as the precise hour of the day when the corps were to reach Ebersdorf. The officers who were to convey them were detained at headquarters, from whence they were not allowed to absent themselves. These preparatory measures having been taken, the emperor only remained a day or 2 longer at Schönbrunn, where he was engaged in business with Monsieur Maret, who regularly laid before him the dispatches of the several ministers, which were brought every week to the army by an auditor of the Council of State, as I have already mentioned in another place. At daybreak of the 3rd July, he mounted his horse and issued directions for all his suite to repair to his tents, which were pitched at the island of Lobau. Ever since the afternoon of the 2nd, the troops had begun to arrive from all directions, a movement which was continued in the night of that day. On the 3rd, during that night also, and again on the 4th, they filed off on the 2 bridges in order to take up a position in the island of Lobau. 150,000 infantry, 750 pieces of cannon, and 300 squadrons of cavalry constituted the Emperor's army. The different corps were stationed in the island according to the order in which they were to cross the bridge of the last arm of the river, so as to avoid the confusion which their numbers might otherwise occasion. General Oudinot was placed at the extreme right. Behind him was the corps of Marshal Davout. On the left, in the rear of Massena's corps, was stationed the army of Italy, and close to it, the corps of Marmont, recently arrived from Dalmatia. Having on its left the Saxon corps under Bernadotte, which had just joined the army. My memory does not enable me to point out the position of the Württemberg troops, which, to the best of my recollection, were to come up as corps of reserve. Cavalry were stationed in the rear of the infantry, but the island afforded such little space that it was impossible for the different corps to move without coming into immediate contact with each other. On the 4th, the Emperor had the bridge thrown over at the same place where the first passage had been effected on the 20th of May, and Marshal Massena immediately took possession of the wood full of briars, which runs along the arm of the Danube at this point. This was not followed up by any other movement. The enemy, however, must have been put upon the alert by this operation, since they set on the same day a general officer's a flag of truce under some pretext or other, which I do not now recollect, but in reality to ascertain what we were doing on the island. That flag of truce was brought into the presence of the Emperor, who ordered the handkerchief to be removed from his eyes and said to him, "I suspect, sir, the motive for which you have been sent here, so much the worse for your general if he does not know that I am to cross the Danube tomorrow with the troops you now behold. I have here 180,000 men, the days are long, woe betide the vanquished. I cannot allow you to return to your army. You shall be conducted to your family in Vienna and have to wait there the issue of the event about to take place." It was known to the Emperor that the general, whose name was Wolf, was the brother of Madame de Kaunitz, one of the ladies who had not time yet to quit Vienna on our approach, and had him accordingly taken to her residence. It is quite accountable that the Austrian army, in the heart of their own country, should have been so far ignorant of our movements as to neglect the precaution of bringing down the troops from Petersburg, which place they ought to have left on the 2nd July at latest. Fortune, however, rewarded the activity and exertions of the Emperor and decided that his army should be the first in readiness to act. The island of Lobau was the second valley of Jehoshaphat. Men who had been 6 years asunder met here in the bank of the Danube for the first time since that long separation. The troops of General Marmont, which had arrived from Dalmatia, were composed of corps that had been out of our sight since the days of the camp at Bologna. All was in readiness in the aftermath of the 4th July, and yet no unusual movement was perceivable on the opposite bank. The day was no sooner closed than the Emperor, who had mounted his horse, superintended in person the operation towards the right, where General Oudinot's corps was stationed. Everything was so well prepared that in an instant the bridge was thrown across. The troops comprising that corps passed over and occupied the point which they were directed to carry. I have omitted to state that on the morning of the 4th, a second bridge intended for the corps of Marshal Massena was thrown across at about 200 toises below the one which had been used for the first passage. The Austrians cannonaded this bridge the whole day without doing injury to a single man or boat. This bridge had been constructed with the materials which remained on our hands after every other work had been completed. As soon as the bridge intended for the corps of General Oudinot was firmly established, the Emperor ordered the 3 bridges to be thrown across, which had been kept together in the sewer I have lately mentioned. As the corps of sailors was no longer required for the preservation of great bridge boats, the services of the men had been applied to these several bridges, so that we were not at a loss for hands in any quarter. The bridge of a single piece was spread out first, being preceded by a small skiff manned by athletic pontonniers. They were provided with an anchor, which they carried over to the opposite bank, and along with other pontonniers hauled the bridge upon which they were now mounted. The tackling which was to secure it had been prepared beforehand, and nothing more was now to be done than to make it fast at both ends, a business altogether so well managed that 10 minutes after the bridge had been brought out of the sewer, the troops were already crossing it. The 2 other bridges were thrown over at the same moment, but took a little longer to get in readiness. These operations, however, succeeded at the appointed time. The enemy had at first scarcely perceived them. A violent storm came out that night which completely drenched everyone, and the guards had taken shelter from the rain, which fell in torrents and with so much violence that no work would have been done had not the emperor been present to stimulate the men. He was on foot on the riverside, listening to what was going forward on the opposite bank and looking in person after the pontonniers, who, however, recognized him in the dark. He was as much drenched as if he had been dipped in the Danube. To this storm, accompanied with lightning and thunder, was added the loud roar of that immense artillery which lined the batteries along the river. They kept up for 2 hours a continual discharge of balls, howitzers, and grape shot against the enemy's shore, by which means our troops were enabled to effect a landing without encountering the slightest obstacle. When all the bridges had been thrown across, the emperor gave directions for his troops to pass, and whilst they were filing off, he retired to take a little rest, having been the whole night on horseback exposed to that heavy rain. He had only with him the Viceroy of Italy, the Prince of Neuchâtel, and myself shortly afterwards. Towards 5 o'clock in the morning, he again mounted his horse, crossed over to the left bank, and began to remodel the order of battle of his army, which after it had crossed over was arranged as follows: Massena on the left, Moletet, Boudet, Lecran, and Carré-Saint-Cyr under his orders. Bernadotte with the Saxons on his right. Oudinot again on the right of the latter. And lastly, Marshal Davout on the extreme right with Friant, Gudin, and Murat's divisions. And the second line was the Viceroy on the left, with the 4 divisions of the Army of Italy, and Marmont with 2 divisions on his right. The reserve was formed of the foot guards, consisting of 6 regiments. In the third line came the cavalry, composed of 4 divisions of light horse, 3 of dragoons, and 3 of cuirassiers, the guards, forming 4 regiments, and the Saxon cavalry. The first movement made by this immense army, after having accomplished the passage, that is to say, at the hour of 10 in the morning, was to alter its front on the extreme left wing and bring the right wing forward. This movement took up a considerable time. The right had upwards of 2 leagues to march before it could come into line. The emperor was constantly going to and fro to reconnoiter the ground whilst his army was coming to its position, and he traveled that day over an incredible extent of ground. He was still in his wonted sound health and could remain on horseback any length of time without experiencing any fatigue. Out of the 72 hours of the 4th, 5th, and 6th of July, he was at least 60 hours on horseback. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon before his army could complete its movement, or he could make it march forward. He expected to meet some obstacles in the plain on the other side of the Danube, such as closed redoubts, which would have prevented his columns from deploying, which everything retreated before him. He did not lose a single man on the only occasion when he might have been attacked with advantage, which was at the passage of the bridges. He experienced his astonishment and not finding the Austrian army, and it being thus allowed to overcome so many difficulties without any resistance being offered to him. We were not yet quite certain of the determination taken by the Archduke's army at Pressburg. The emperor had calculated upon the probability of its having rejoined the Archduke Charles, whom he supposed acquainted with the fact of his having crossed the Danube. As soon as the army was in readiness, he made it march forward, and it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon before he could come in sight of the Austrian army, which had not stirred from its position at Wagram. We then learned for the first time that it had not been joined by the corps which was at Pressburg, as however such a junction could not now be effected without going a great way around, and the emperor no longer bestowed a thought upon that corps, but bent his whole mind upon directing the attack against the Archduke Charles, whose position, however excellent in other respects, was too extended not to prevent some weak points to the assailant. Towards 6 o'clock in the evening, the cannonade commenced in the center of the 2 armies. Our right was still advancing because the enemy's left yielded a little ground, so that the night passed over without any important occurrences. Our left had a trifling encounter with the enemy's right. The only object on the other side was to take up a position for the next day. In the center, however, matters took a more serious turn. The emperor, seeing the hostile army so near, attempted to debouch by the center in order to reach, if possible, the plateau upon which the Austrian army was stationed and established himself there, though he had not determined to persist unless he saw a good chance of succeeding. The troops were allowed a moment's rest. At the point at which General Oudinot was placed was the most in advance, and he was the first in readiness to commence the attack, and a division of the Army of Italy was brought up to support him. The Emperor had ordered both columns to attack at the same moment, but as the divisions of the Army of Italy had somewhat longer march to perform, they did not ascend the plateau together. General Oudinot's division first made its appearance on the crest, from whence it was almost immediately driven back and compelled to retreat in great confusion, which was, however, soon repaired by the bringing up of some cavalry to rally the soldiers, who, it should be said to their credit, instantly resumed their ranks, notwithstanding the fire of the enemy's artillery. The division of the Army of Italy was not more successful. It was headed by the 106th Regiment, which had no sooner shown itself on the plateau than it was charged and driven back close under the fire of our artillery, on which occasion the regiment lost one of its eagles. The Emperor was present when the confusion occurred and would not follow up those attacks because the night was approaching and some decisive event would necessarily place on the morrow. Experience had already told us that the loss we suffered in the evening of the 21st of May had a powerful influence over the battle of the 22nd. The Emperor therefore ordered that a position should be taken up and that hostilities should cease in order that the army might pass the night undisturbed. He established his bivouac between the grenadiers and the foot officers of the guard, whom he had brought up to the first line, and he summoned to his presence the generals who held the chief commands of the several corps, and passed a great part of the night in conferring with them respecting the events likely to occur on the following day. On the day previous to our crossing the Danube, Marshal Massena had had a fall from his horse, which obliged him to be conveyed in a calash to the field of battle. The Emperor was desirous of giving him a successor, but the Marshal insisted he would not. The Emperor, however, foresaw that on so busy a day, Marshal Massena could not move in a calash in every direction where a horse might take him, and he placed one of his aides-de-camp by his side. The Emperor had at first made choice of me for that purpose, and even mentioned it to me, though I had to perform Monsieur de Caulaincourt's duties and was much wanted in his person. But being anxious not to disoblige Marshal Massena, who would then have given up the command of his corps, he at last determined to send Raya, who had been the Marshal's aide-de-camp and was accustomed to obey him, in order that the Marshal might have some confidential officer near his person. The corps of Marshal Massena was not yet in line with us. The Emperor, sending the Marshal back to his troops, desired him to bring them up the next morning to join the Grand Army. He sent off all the general divisions in succession to their respective corps. Marshal Davout alone remained with him the latter part of the night. The plain on which the army was bivouacking was so barren of trees and houses, and not a single light was to be seen from the right to the left of it. There was great difficulty in finding a couple truces of straw and some fragments of doors to light a small fire for the Emperor's use. Everyone slept wrapped up in his cloak, and a bitter cold was felt the whole night. I passed on my legs near the fire because the Emperor had directed me to be careful that answers should be given to the officers and orderlies who under such circumstances go over the lines during the whole night, mostly in search of the Emperor and of the generals commanding the several corps of the army. On the eve of a battle, he was mindful of the smallest details and would not allow anyone to pass without receiving the information sought for. He slept but little that night. I had placed myself before him to screen his eyes from the blaze with the skirts of my cloak, but whether he felt cold or that his mind was too much engaged, he was up before daylight. But he did not order the troops to arm until 4 o'clock in the morning of that day, the 6th of July, 1809. Chapter 8. The enemy commenced the attack by their left bearing down on our right, and that is to say upon the corps of Marshal Davout, which showed itself at the village of Margraf Neusiedl. From the point at which we stood, we called it the village of the square tower, because it has in fact an old feudal castle surmounted by a large square tower, which is seen from every part of the plain. I have heard that the attack upon Marshal Davout was led on by the Prince John of Liechtenstein. It was sufficiently severe to satisfy us that it was no feigned enterprise of the enemy. We were justified in supposing that they contemplated to extend the front beyond our sight in order to communicate with the corps, which we expected was marching from Pressburg. But whatever may have been the object they had in view, the Emperor ordered Marshal Davout to drive them back without allowing them to recover. And he sent him the cavalry division of General Nansoudy, who had with him a company of horse artillery to enable his taking advantage of any success he might obtain. It is to be observed that the Marshal had already at his disposal the division of cuirassiers of the Duke of Padua, the same that was commanded by the General d'Espagne previously to the Battle of Essling. The action soon commenced. The Emperor repaired to the spot and sent in that direction all the horse and foot guards with the whole of his artillery, expecting every moment the appearance of the court coming from Pressburg. But he had scarcely arrived when we beheld the Austrian army in motion, retiring from the position it occupied in front of Marshal Davout and maneuvering in an opposite direction. The Emperor ordered his guard to halt and began to watch the enemy's motions. At this moment, General Raya came up from Massena's corps and announced to us that affairs were going on very badly in that quarter, and that not a moment was to be lost in proceeding thither, that is to say, in crossing the whole field of battle from right to left. The Emperor's first measure was to send back with General Raya the Prince of Neuchâtel, who, on a day of battle, never spared himself and was a keen observer of its details, and he made the guard return by the same road they had come. In order to execute this movement, its artillery, consisting of 80 pieces of cannon, opened the march. The Emperor passed along the whole army, formed in battle array, and came to his left wing, which no longer existed. In other words, the corps of Marshal Massena was in a complete state of dissolution, and the 4 divisions composing it did not present a single united body, so that the left of our army was in reality the Saxon Corps, commanded by Bernadotte, which an hour before was on Marshal Massena's right. The following is an account of what had taken place. Marshal Massena had maneuvered the whole morning to join the Grand Army whilst engaged in that movement. The Austrian army was considerably reinforcing its right with the view of attacking our left. The consequence was Marshal Massena was so quickly overpowered that there had hardly been time to consider of the means of relieving him whilst effecting this movement to join the Emperor. It was necessary that he should direct the village of Aderklave to be attacked, a duty which was assigned to the General Carré St-Cyr's division. The 24th Regiment of Light Infantry, being at the head of that column, commenced the charge in so bold a manner that it carried the village. Fortune seemed to have opened to the troops on the other side of the village of Aderklave, a broad hollow road, the one leading to Wagram, where that gallant regiment would have been almost completely under shelter. Common sense suggested its being brought into that road, which formed a natural redoubt. But owing to a serious fault of the officer in command there, the 24th Regiment was made to step over the hollow road and to station itself at the entrance of the village, where, being wholly unprotected, it had to sustain a dreadful fire of musketry. Was charged after suffering a severe loss, and in the confusion of retreating drew along with it the remainder of St-Cyr's division, which consisted in a great measure of allied troops, such as those from Baden, Darmstadt, and other countries. This defeat occasioned the rout of the troops commanded by General Legrand and Boudet. The latter lost all his artillery. Our left, in short, had become nothing more than a large opening, through which the right of the Austrian army penetrated so far that the batteries of the island of Lobau, which had protected our passage, were under the necessity of again opening their tremendous fire in order to stop the enemy's columns now boldly advancing towards our bridges. The enemy's right was taking up a position in a perpendicular line to our extreme left and compelled us to give it the form of an angle for the purpose of returning the enemy's fire. They had placed some pieces of artillery in such a manner as to fire upon the angle or elbow, whilst they were cannonading us on both sides of the angle. I know not what the Emperor's object, but he remained a full hour at that angle, which was a perfect stream of shot. And as there was no fire of musketry kept up, the soldier was becoming discouraged. The emperor was more sensible than anyone else that such a situation could not last long, and he remained there for the purpose of remedying the disorder. In the height of the danger, he rode in front of the line upon the horse, as white as snow. It was called Euphrates, and had been sent to him as a present from the Sophie of Persia. He proceeded from one extremity of the line to the other, and returned at a slow pace. It will easily be believed that shots were flying about him in every direction. I kept behind, with my eyes riveted upon him, expecting at every moment to see him drop from the horse. After having fully examined everything, he completed his arrangements just as the guard had come up to this fearfully exposed left wing. He ordered his aide-de-camp, General Lauriston, who commanded the 80 pieces of artillery of the guard, to fire them in one compact battery upon the center of the enemy's army. He sent in the rear of that battery the division of the young guard commanded on this occasion by General Raya, who had been previously with Marshal Massena. He placed himself on Lauriston's left and to the right of that battery, and directed the 2 divisions of the Army of Italy under Marshal Macdonald's orders to move forward. Those 3 masses advanced in the direction of Aderklave and were followed by the cavalry of the guard, of which the emperor only kept with him the regiment of horse grenadiers. The rest of the cavalry was sent to arrest the right of the Austrians in their advance. The emperor had ordered that as soon as the opening, which he intended to make in the enemy's center, could have been effected, the whole cavalry should charge and wheel round upon all the troops that had penetrated to the extremity of our left. He had just given directions in consequence to Marshal Bissier, and the latter had barely started to execute them when he was knocked down by the most extraordinary cannon shot ever seen. A shot in full sweep tore his breeches open from the top of the thigh to the knee, running along the thigh in a zigzag form, as if it had been a thunderbolt. He was so suddenly thrown off his horse that we fancied he had been killed on the spot. The same shot forced the barrel from his pistol and carried off both barrel and stock. The emperor had also seen him fall, but not recognizing him at first, he asked, "Who is it?" This was his usual expression. "Monsieur, sire," was the reply. He instantly turned his horse around, saying, "Let us go, for I have no time to weep. Let us avoid another scene." He alluded to the regret he had felt at the loss of Marshall Lannes. "He sent me to see if Bessières was still alive. He had just been carried off the ground and had recovered his senses, having merely been struck in the thigh, which was completely paralyzed." This untoward cannon shot left the cavalry without a leader during the most important quarter of an hour in the day, which was to have an immense influence over the battle. Immediately after the accident, the emperor sent me with an order for General Nansudi to charge whatever troops were before him. These were the Austrian right, which had formed into a solid mass. Nansudi's division had 6 regiments, including the 2 of Carbineers. Behind him was General Saint-Sulpice's division, composed of 4 regiments. I found him in a very unpromising situation. He was exposed to a very destructive cannonade. On receiving the order to charge, he prepared to obey it and started off in a trot, but the firing of the Austrians was so warmly kept up that it stopped the division, who suffered at a loss of 1,200 horse killed on the spot. It would not have been more bad had it been a full charge, of course, which, if practicable, would have been attended with immense results, as it would have occasioned the surrender of a great part of the Austrian right. In the meanwhile, the artillery of the guard was making a dreadful havoc among the enemy's centers, such as might have been expected from 80 pieces of cannon, all 12 and 8-pounders, served by picked artillerymen. The troops of General Raya advanced upon Aderklave, and General Macdonald, who was on the right of that battery, gave to the whole army an admirable example of personal courage by marching at the head of his 2 divisions, formed in columns, and leading them under a shower of balls and grape shot up to the very lines of the enemy at a slow pace, without their falling into the least confusion. The firing of cannon and the march of Macdonald forced an opening in the center of the army and separated their right from the rest of the army. The emperor, who was present on the ground, was again anxious that the cavalry should take advantage of so fine an opportunity. He sent orders to the guards to charge, but whether the order was incorrectly reported or not, it was not carried into effect, and that immense and splendid cavalry did not take a single man, whilst if it had been led on by a bold and resolute officer, it could not have failed to make many prisoners. A particular opportunity afforded at one time for the taking 1/4 of at least the Austrian army. We greatly regretted on this occasion the absence of the Grand Duke of Berg. He was the very man we wanted at so critical a moment. The emperor was greatly displeased with the cavalry, and he said on the field of battle, "It never served me in this manner before. It will be the cause of this battle not being attended with any result." He retained in consequence for a long time a feeling of rancor against the generals who commanded the cavalry regiments of his guard, and he would have made an example of them had he not taken into consideration some old and valuable services they had previously rendered. Notwithstanding so many faults, the battle was decided in our favor. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the enemy's right had retreated and was endeavoring to join the main army by avoiding the opening we had made in its center. On our right, Marshal Davout had ascended the plateau of Margraf Neusiedl and succeeded in maintaining his ground. The emperor ordered Wagram to be attacked by Oudinot's corps, supported by the other 2 divisions of the army of Italy. That column also penetrated into the position of the Austrians and maintained itself there the whole evening. The enemy retreated on all points towards 4 o'clock, abandoning the field of battle to us, but without leaving any prisoners or cannon behind, and after having fought in a manner calculated to instill a cautious conduct into any man disposed to deeds of rashness. They were followed, though at a respectful distance, for they had not been forced, and we were not at all anxious to drive them to the necessity of resuming their order of battle until we should have succeeded in detaching some portion of the main body. Marshal Massena's corps had reorganized itself and resumed in its former position. Although the triumph of our arms was beyond question, we did not urge the pursuit so far as the road leading from Vienna to Brem. The Austrians marched the whole night and retired by the road from Vienna to Zanim and by the road to Volkersdorf, also towards the town of Znaim. The emperor slept on the field of battle in the midst of his troops. His tent was scarcely pitched when an alarm spread in an instant throughout the army, which it had well nigh thrown into disorder. It was created by marauders, who, having wandered too far, were pursued by bodies of cavalry belonging to the Archduke Ferdinand's army, which had reached the river March, and was no doubt endeavoring to open a communication with the Grand Army. The soldiers ran to arms in all directions, but the alarm soon subsided. Thus ended the memorable action of Wagram, the results of which on the field of battle were not commensurate with the prodigious labors and the scientific conceptions which had preceded the immediate arrangements for the conflict. The army stood in need of some of those men accustomed to turn success to the utmost advantage and to carry off whole bodies of troops at a decisive crisis. The emperor alone did everything. By his presence, he checked the disorder at the moment of the catastrophe that befell our left wing. The whole population of Vienna ascended the roofs of the houses and the ramparts from whence it witnessed the battle. In the morning, the ladies of that city were flushed with the hope of our defeat, which changed to a general gloom towards 2 in the afternoon. The retreat of the Austrian army was as plainly distinguished as it could have been from the field of battle. The Austrian army successfully resisted our attacks at almost every point. It was extremely numerous and ought to have been joined by the army at Pressburg, although it was in a great measure composed of the Landwehr, who were indifferently trained to war. On 2 remarkable circumstances of the battle, it ought to have acted more judiciously than it did. In the first place, the enemy ought not to have abandoned the attack made upon our right at the beginning of the action. By persisting in that attack, they would have prevented the grand retrograde movement of the troops, which we transferred from our right to our left wing. In the second place, they ought to have followed up the success obtained by their right over the corps of Massena and brought their center fully into play without allowing us time to move to the point where Massena had stationed 100 pieces of cannon and as many squadrons with 3 that quarter. The Austrians had no cause to retreat. It was in greater strength than we were, since a third of our army consisted of foreign troops, the amalgamation of which with their own was attended with many disadvantages. It thought proper, however, to retire from the field, and no doubt felt itself unable to run the risk of further events, of the results of which it no longer entertained any sanguine hopes. The emperor was going over the field of battle the same evening when intelligence was brought to him of the death of General Lassalle, who had just been killed by one of the last musket shots fired before the final retreat of the enemy. That general had had in the morning a strange presentiment of fate that awaited him, the acquisition of glory that had been an object of much greater solicitude to him than the advancement of his fortune. But on the night previous to the battle, he seemed to have had the fate of his children strongly impressed upon his mind, and he awoke to draw up a petition to the emperor in their behalf, which he placed in his sabretache. When the emperor passed in the morning in front of his division, General Lassalle did not address him, but he stopped Monsieur Marais, who was a few paces ahead, and told him that, never having asked any favors of the emperor, he begged he would charge of the petition which he then handed to him, in case any misfortune should befall him. A few hours afterwards he was no more. The emperor was but indifferently pleased with the result of the battle of Wagram. He would desired a repetition of Marengo, of Austerlitz, or of Vienna, the object of his wishes. But he was so far foiled that the Austrian army wasn't broken. It retreated to take up another position, which would again call for new exertions of his mind to bring about an engagement attended with a more signal result. That army, moreover, might succeed in effecting a junction with the army which was on its march from Pressburg, whilst we, on the contrary, we had no reinforcements whatever to expect. We were but too well aware that no dependence was to be placed upon the Russian army. The only point we had gained in respect to it was that it would not join the Austrians at a moment which fortune did not yet to appear to have marked out as the limit of her favors to us. The Russians only put 15,000 men in motion, whose cooperation was confined to an attempt to get the start of the Polish troops at Krakow, a movement which never appeared to the emperor in any way other than in a suspicious light. The signal events of a war are always followed by a moral effect, upon which public opinion for or against either of the contending parties is generally formed. The Battle of Essling had turned the tide of opinion against us. That unfavorable impression was destroyed by the Battle of Wagram, which to a certain extent reinstated us in the public mind. This favorable change, so in pronouncing itself so long as any doubt hung over the reality of our success, was confirmed by the fact of our following the Austrian army in its retreat. Chapter 14. On the following day, the 7th of July, the emperor rode over the field of battle according to his usual practice, to see if the hospital departments had caused all the wounded to be removed. As this was harvest time, the corn was very high, and it was impossible to see the soldiers lying stretched upon the ground. Many of those unfortunate wounded had placed their handkerchiefs at the end of their muskets and held them up as a signal for assistance. The emperor repaired in person to every spot where he perceived such signals. He addressed words of consolation to the wounded, and would not move forward until the last of them had been carried off the field. He kept no one to attend them, and ordered Marshall Lannes to have all the men picked up, to see that the movable hospitals did not slacken their exertions. General Lannes was known for his precision and severity. The emperor, therefore, often selected him for the commissions of that nature. As he was going over the field of battle, he stopped on the ground, which had been occupied by MacDonald's 2 divisions, exhibited the picture of a loss fully commensurate with the valor they had displayed. The emperor recognized amongst the slain a colonel who had given him some cause for displeasure. That officer who had made the campaign of Egypt had misbehaved after the departure of General Bonaparte and proved ungrateful towards his benefactor, in hopes, no doubt, of insinuating himself into good graces of the general who had succeeded him. On the return of the army from Egypt to France, the emperor, who had shown him many marks of kindness during the war in Italy, gave no sign of resentment, but granted him none of those favors which he heaped upon all those who had been in Egypt. The emperor now said, on seeing him stretched upon the field of battle, I regret not having been able to speak to him before the battle in order to tell him that I had long forgotten everything. A few steps farther on, he discovered a young quartermaster of the regiment of carbineers still alive, although a shot had gone through his head, but the heat and dust had almost immediately congealed the blood so that the brains could not be affected by the air. The emperor dismounted, felt his pulse, and with his handkerchief endeavored to clear the nostrils, which were filled with earth. He then applied a little brandy to his lips, whereupon the wounded man opened his eyes, though he appeared at first to be quite insensible to the act of humanity exercised towards him. But having again opened them and fixed them on the emperor, whom he now recognized, they immediately filled with tears, and he would have sobbed, had not his strength forsaken him. The wretched man could not escape death, according to the opinion of the surgeons who were called to his assistance. After having gone over the ground where the army had fought, the emperor went to place himself in the midst of the troops, which were beginning to move for the purpose of following the retreating army. On passing by MacDonald, he stopped and held out his hand to him, saying, Shake hands, MacDonald. No more animosity between us. We must henceforward be friends, and as a pledge of my sincerity, I will send you your marshal's staff, which you so gloriously earned in yesterday's battle. MacDonald had been in a kind of disgrace for many years. It would be difficult to assign any reason for it, except the intrigue and jealousy to which an elevated mind is always exposed. Malevolence had succeeded in prevailing upon the emperor to remove him from his presence, and his innate pride of heart had prevented his taking any step to be reconciled to a sovereign who did not treat him with that kindness to which he felt he had a claim. Years of glory were passing by, and MacDonald took no share in what was going forward, when the declarations of war of 1809 decided the emperor to give him the command of a corps under the orders of the Viceroy of Italy. Fortune crowned his constancy, and victory reinstated him in a rank which he proved himself worthy to hold at a moment when so many others appeared to do everything to degrade it, and accordingly fell in the esteem of their countrymen. The army took the two roads from Vienna to Zenaim and from Vienna to Brunn. The emperor followed the latter as far as Wolkersdorf, and from thence took the crossroad leading to Zenaim. He stopped at Wolkersdorf on the 7th and wrote from thence to the Emperor of Russia. On the 8th, he stopped in the rear of the position occupied by his troops, which had already reached Zenaim, where they had come up with the Austrian rearguard. Early in the morning of the 9th, after dispatching orders in various directions, he was taken rather seriously ill in consequence of all his fatigues and exertions. This circumstance compelled him to indulge in a little rest whilst his troops were advancing. Marshal Bernadotte came at that time to see the emperor, who had left orders that no one should disturb him until he called. I therefore refused to introduce the marshal, the object of whose visit was wholly unknown to me. I had witnessed the lukewarmness which his troops had evinced in the battle. Ever since the opening of the campaign, he had been incessantly complaining of want of ardor in his troops, of their inexperience, and of the want of confidence in their leaders. I should therefore have exhausted every supposition before I could have imagined that, contradicting on a sudden the unfavorable opinion he had given of their courage, he could ever dream that those troops had decided the victory we had just obtained. The emperor was soon made acquainted with that unaccountable order of the day. He sent for the self-conceited marshal and removed him from the command of his troops. The lesson was ineffectual. Bernadotte, who persisted in maintaining the justice of the ridiculous congratulations he had addressed to the Saxons, caused them to be inserted in the public papers. The emperor was indignant at this conduct, being at all times inflexibly severe against every impropriety of conduct and every falsehood. though he was unwilling at the same time to wound the feelings of men who had exposed their lives in his service. The insult, however, was such a shock that he felt it impossible to pass by. He issued an order of the day, which he directed the Major General not to circulate either amongst the army at large or the Saxon troops, of which he had given the command to General Renier. The following are the terms in which the letter transmitting the order of the Major General was couched. My cousin, you will find annexed an order of the day which you will distribute among the several marshals, apprising them at the same time that it is for their private information. You will not send it to General Renier. You will forward it to the 2 ministers of war and also to the King of Westphalia. Order of the day. From our imperial camp at Schönbrunn, the 11th of July, 1809, His Majesty expresses to Marshal the Prince of Pontecorvo his displeasure at the order of the day from the latter, bearing the date Leopoldau, the 7th of July, which has been simultaneously inserted in almost all the newspapers. It is of the following tenor: Saxons! In the battle of the 5th of July, 7,000 or 8,000 men of your nation pierced through the center of the enemy's army and penetrated as far as Deutsch Wagram. Notwithstanding the opposition of 40,000 men supported by 50 pieces of cannon, you fought until midnight and bivouacked in the heart of the Austrian lines. On the 6th at daybreak, the battle recommenced in your part with the same obstinacy. And in the midst of the havoc created by the hostile artillery, your living columns remain as firm as brass. The great Napoleon witnessed your devoted valor. He reckons you as being amongst the number of his gallant soldiers, Saxons. The soldier's fortune consists in fulfilling his duties. You have worthily performed those that devolved upon you. Bivouac of Leopoldau, the 7th of July, 1809.